friend of the association, the hopefully clairvoyant Iain Anderson, for his macro view on politics, the economy, and regulation, with a particular focus on the economic and political impact of Covid-19 and what it all might mean for the UK's financial services and healthcare sectors. So without any further ado, Iain, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, for that kind introduction. I'm going to assume in the etiquette that is Zoom, I've come off mute and you can all hear me. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, whether or not I'm the Chris Whitty to Stuart's rather more glamorous JVT, Jonathan Van Tam, I don't know. But look, what I'm going to try and do is in the next 15 minutes or so, just give you a kind of literally tour de force through some of the macro politics and trends that we're going to see around us. Now, the first task, as ever in these events, is to try and share my screen. So let's try and do that. And hopefully we're in a good place. How's that looking for you, Stuart? Excellent. Right. So look, this is titled Political Risk. As Stuart said, there's a lot of it about. It's my kind of stock in trade at Cicero, AMII. We advise lots of folks in the insurance and wider financial services sector and beyond. So what I want to try and do in the next 15 minutes is just give you a sense of some of those big ticket things to be thinking about. I'm not a clairvoyant. What I am going to do, though, is just give you a sense of some of the moving parts, and there are lots of them right now. So let's get into it. You know, just before you had your conference last year, the UK was going into a general election, and the outcome of that election, well, all the received wisdom going into Christmas last year was that Boris Johnson would be Prime Minister probably for a decade. The Conservatives would have a majority for a decade. Britain had decisively rejected a big state. Britain had rejected a large public sector. And yet, of course, within that general election, the National Health Service and who would best fund and protect the National Health Service was right at the heart of the conversation. Well, that was then, and here we are now. I mean, the events of almost every day right now have changed all of that. The Prime Minister's not been able to get on with his levelling up agenda. COVID has completely wrecked his domestic agenda, and he and his government are now spending more than Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell could have ever dreamed of. And as we sit down for our conference today, we do so just days after a huge reset for this government. You know, the very public departure of the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, has already, believe you me, in my day job, it is absolutely and fundamentally changed the architecture of the way in which the Johnson administration is operating. Frankly, there were favoured friends. And I think if a grand reset is possible for the Johnson administration, and there are huge questions as to whether or not it is possible, believe you me, Conservative MPs remain incredibly nervous. This does not feel like a government with a large 80-seat majority anymore, but it does feel like a government that is about to embark on a new journey. And why are those Conservative MPs very nervous? Those in the governing party are always very nervous when they go behind the opposition in the opinion polls. That's what's happening. Labour's opened up a lead in the past month or so of about 5 points over the Tories. You could argue, given what's happened this year, Labour should have an even larger lead over the Conservatives right now. But that's where we are as we're getting into the end of the year, and governments get very, very nervous in that situation. So I'm certainly expecting a pretty fundamental reshuffle of the Conservative pack of the cabinet, an attempt to freshen up the government in the new year, not least when you look at the right-hand side of the slide and you see what government approval ratings are doing, and really what the Prime Minister's approval rating has been doing throughout 2020. So the Conservatives, a year ago, when you last had your conference, their tails were up, the sense that they were in power for a while, that the idea of a Conservative government and a typical agenda of a smaller state and a smaller role for the state, and an attempt at lower public spending and fiscal rectitude, all of that has gone out of the window. The numbers too indicate that, I think as we get into, and this is not being a soothsayer, this is just a reality of where we are, that consistently support for Scottish independence over the past now 12 opinion polls now takes the SNP and proponents of independence to a majoritarian view in Scotland. This is going to dominate politics domestically next year. It's going to crowd out a heck of a lot of the conversation that Boris Johnson wants to get into. He wanted to get into his levelling up manifesto agenda this year. He will want to try and get into it next year. But if you cast your mind back to 2012 and 2013, and in the run-up to the last Scottish independence referendum in September 2014, believe you me, this is going to suck up political capital. And of course, the reason it's there is as a result of the kind of 4-speed UK that we can now see. And actually, in terms of the health debate, the 4-speed health debate that we can now see taking place in the UK. So the fragmentation that has been building through devolution, not just in Scotland, but also in Wales, and how the Welsh health system performs, but also actually regionally in England, how the health system is performing under a lot of strain. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing is that government is really looking at how to just kind of work through what the shape and structure of the monolithic NHS actually is going to look like. We know that they're already planning to take action, and they've announced that they'll take action on Public Health England. So the shape and understanding of the health system is up for grabs. The other huge big event, ladies and gentlemen, that partly has created, I think, the change in Downing Street is what's happened in America. With the Biden win, and despite President Trump's Twitter feed, Joe Biden will be the next American president. And he's got a pretty important agenda that I think is going to flow directly into what happens in terms of policy here in the UK. The UK Prime Minister is already trying to lean in to some of his agenda, but I think it's pretty important in terms of the context of the debate that this audience has to deal with. Because his priorities are, of course, immediately the health emergency and getting to grips with the health emergency, and his manifesto. If you look at his website, buildbackbetter.com, he is starting to lay out what he wants to do very, very early in his agenda. So health and dealing with the health emergency and the structure of American healthcare, key priorities. Alongside that, economic recovery, climate change, that's where UK policy and Boris Johnson's trying to lead in. And then, yes, the racial divide in America. It effectively, that was one of the issues that elected Joe Biden, and it's going to be really important for him and his domestic policy piece. One of the first things he faces is, of course, the likely continuing challenges to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, in the US courts. Trump, of course, creating his centre-right majority in the Supreme Court, although you will have noticed the other day that the Supreme Court not striking down the legislation. And everything I'm picking up from the Biden team and my team in America is getting the sense of this, that they are really going to double down on the healthcare agenda as much as they can. They're going to try and deliver quite a lot of the healthcare agenda by executive order rather than having to go through Congress. So watch out for that and the impact that it's going to have in terms of the debate here. Well, look, hey, you were talking about Brexit last year. We're talking about Brexit again this year. Let me just give you a sense really quickly about what we can expect in terms of that debate, because I think people have got their heads around this. Now, certainly the big providers, the multinational groups in financial services have moved stuff around. We as a business actually opened in Dublin because that classic thing, follow the clients. And lots of clients were using Dublin as a hub. Others are using other locations as a hub. But into some of the SME market, and it's the SME market that the government is most concerned about. Brexit ready, people have started to work through, frankly, what their own immediate supply chain looks like. And many of them, of course, are quite concerned at the prospect of no deal right now. So the talks are ongoing, and I suppose the good news, as we're sitting here today, Stuart, is that the conversation has gone quiet. When these conversations are being played out in public, and there's a war of words going on Twitter, I get worried. Past 2 or 3 days, it's gone quiet again. That's got to be a good sign, but there are still some pretty fundamental issues that need resolution. What are they? Fishing, not vast economically, but really important totemically and really important in terms of course, the debate that's taking place about Scotland's place in the UK in particular. The question of the level playing field and whether or not the EU is going to bend on that, or whether or not it actually wants a ratchet effect. Every time the EU does a piece of legislation, it just moves up the ratchet in terms of what the UK would have to do. And then who governs this? The UK does not want the governance of these mechanisms anywhere near ultimately the European Court of Justice. Those three issues, despite all the stuff that's rolling around, the 600 pages that we currently understand the a negotiated deal to look like, these three issues remain fundamental. And then literally the next 4 or 5 days are going to be so important. So look, I mean, really quickly, I would put the likelihood of no deal right now, politically, it's all a question of politics, at about 30%. The idea of a very skinny deal at about 50 to 60%. And if my maths is right, a comprehensive agreement being maybe 10%, all of those 600 pages being passed. But there are still really important issues for parts of the financial services sector, not least how equivalence will apply. The UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak set out the other day his vision of equivalence. The EU are steadfastly not biting, they're not responding to any of that. Contract continuity and digital, really, really important issues that just still remain unresolved on the table. In fact, more widely, financial services not really been a core part of this negotiation at all. If you look at some of the sectors that we can think about in terms of who is feeling well prepared for a Brexit deal or no deal, energy, media, telecoms, that as far as I can see, looking pretty okay with what's happening. A reasonable level of preparedness from these sectors in the middle there. Interesting, the life sciences sector, less anxious than it was when I was talking to it right at the start of the Brexit process, but automotive, construction, industrial, real problems. So again, thinking about your own audiences and their propensity to want to have a conversation, to what you were saying, Stuart, up front about people's level of preparedness and their economic capacity to roll forward plans and policies into 2021. I think that hopefully just gives you a good sense of where some of the sectors are. Here's the timeline. You're going to get these slides anyway, so I won't dwell on that. But really, the next 3 or 4 days are pretty critical. There's a summit at the end of this week. We're not going to get any kind of deal before then, I don't think. But watch out for puffs of white smoke over the weekend into the early part of next week. I think if a deal is happening, we are going to know in the coming week. This couldn't be more critical right now. A deal has been done, a free trade deal has been done with Japan. I actually hosted a conversation yesterday with Liz Truss and the Australian High Commissioner. So Australia wants to be early. It wanted to be earlier than Japan. But some of these free trade arrangements are, of course, going to set up some interesting opportunities and conversations for folks in the sector. It's looking like Australia and New Zealand are going to be pretty quickly set up next. United States entirely depends on Biden's propensity to do a conversation with the UK. Obviously, the US less likely to do a trade deal with the UK if there is a no deal Brexit and there's problems on the Northern Ireland border. Just to finish, the role of the sector is something you talked about, Stuart. I mean, the bad news is I've got to underscore what you said to us in that in 2007, 2008, 2009, it was the banking sector that government and policymakers really bear down on. Insurance generally has not had a good COVID. And it's very unfair, but it's completely dominated in Treasury and policymakers and the FCA's eyes by business interruption cover. So there is a massive cloud that is hanging over the sector as a result of this. Now, the sector lent in terms of providing capacity for the NHS and the early stages of COVID. I think the government will want to make some pretty key demands for the critical months ahead before the vaccine starts to happen, but also on the delivery of the vaccine. So the more your sector can lean in to, shall we say, the COVID support effort, continue to lean in to the COVID support effort, I think you're going to be able to create some differentiation between yourselves and other parts of the insurance world. We've had many statements from Rishi Sunak. We're going to get another one next week in the comprehensive spending review. Well, it's slightly less comprehensive. It's just a 1-year spending review. The numbers on health have already been set, but watch out for potential surprises. Watch out for the start of potential windfall taxes on sectors that have been performing relatively well through COVID. And as we saw with the energy companies in the past, we've seen with the banks in the past, the insurers might be some interesting rich pickings given what we were talking about and what Stuart said up front. So, surprises often come out of budget boxes. This is a 1-year comprehensive spending review rather than a 3-year planned term because of COVID. But as ever, he likes to catch the eye politically. Watch out for some interesting stuff. And Stuart, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Insight into the whole macro scenario. One of the things, we've probably got sort of 5 minutes tops. One of the things that Rishi Sunak said recently was that the UK earns about 26 billion a year in financial services revenue from the EU. And you've touched on it in what you said there. apparently we are quite willing to give equivalency to the European Union in terms of our interactive trading. But they, in response, have come back and said, well, no, we can't consider a reciprocal arrangement across the 27 EU states. You guys are going to have to go and do it one by one on your own. Is that not catastrophic for us?
It's very difficult, but it's such, the sector is a bargaining chip, Stuart. Yeah. The sector is a bargaining chip. In my upfront comments and your question yourself, Rishi Sunak laid out his prospectus, the UK's prospectus for equivalence in the House of Commons last week. If you haven't, for those who are on the call, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, just watch it back on parliament.tv or indeed read it. So he talks about how important financial services is. That's really good. He talks about that economic contribution. He says, and he's made the FCA and the regulators say, look, this is our starting point on equivalence. Until there's a deal or not, Stuart, the EU is not going to move. Yeah. And look, I mean, whatever you think about Brexit, the thing that I think is true is a deal will make the possibility of a later conversation about equivalence politically much easier. If there is no deal, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and quite a lot of intensity to the conversation. So, and that's why I talked about Biden, because sat here in the UK right now, I mean, one of the things that we have heard from Boris Johnson's government is that they want, potentially the UK to have a much more free, a much more open regulatory environment. Mm-hmm. Now, Biden may force America into a much more, into some higher regulatory barriers. Europe will certainly want to continue with some higher regulatory barriers. There might be a decision here for the UK to say that you're actually, we want to suck in more business by, by maintaining a more open regulatory posture. Can't answer that yet, but the politics is really important for the regulation around you.
Yeah, because I think Christopher Woolard, some little time ago, he actually said, not sort of overtly, but quite subtly, he said that he felt that the UK would have pursued a softer touch regulatory regime without the constraints of the EU driving it. So I think we would all hope for that, because, I think if you spoke to all of our members, whether they're insurers or intermediaries, every single one of them would say that, the days of us selling business and processing business are no longer the focus. It's all about ensuring there's no consumer detriment, acting in the consumer's best interest, which we all advocate. But I think the thing is, it's about how it's evidenced and how onerous that evidencing is. And any relaxation on that, I am sure, would be greatly appreciated.
Andrew Bailey made a speech yesterday, which was quite widely reported, which, and obviously before he turned up at the bank, Andrew was at the CEO at the FCA, giving a really big nod, Stuart, to the idea of the UK going it alone, in a way. Yeah. Now, he's not making that speech in a vacuum, is he? That speech will have been cleared by Treasury. So again, a little bit of light reading for everybody with later in the day. I'd recommend what Bailey had to say yesterday, or certainly the media reports of it, to give you a sense of where the tenor of this is moving.
Brilliant. Look, one last question, and then I think time constraints mean that we'll pass on to Barry. So if we're sitting here now, one positive thing that all of us could take away, what would be your optimistic vision in 2021?
Yeah, so look, we can now see some light at the end of the tunnel. There's some very good news on the vaccine, even better news on the vaccines today. I think there is no doubt, we'll hear from Ed later about how people are feeling about all this, but the fact that we've not been able to see a way out of this. I mean, I had Public Health England telling me and one of my clients about 2 months ago that we'd still be wearing masks and socially distancing until the autumn of 2022. Now, if the vaccine is on the way, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It is going to save lives. That's the most important thing here. But I think the other thing for this conference, Stuart, is that if people didn't think that health and well-being was important before COVID, my goodness, every single politician does now. So it's up to this sector to continue to make the case, but also, I would say, as you did in the spring, to continue to lean in.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Insightful as always. I will give you a plug that you don't know about. So if there are any of you who are interested in business, politics, and Brexit, can I suggest you read this? This is Iain's book. So although he and I had spoken on 2 or 3 occasions as we moved towards him presenting today, as part of my homework, I read his book, which I found insightful. So
the check's in the post, Stuart. Thank you.
That's it. I don't think I can eat and drink as much as this could cost you. Iain, thank you very much as always. We